"I can feel it coming in the air tonight, hold on." Those words delivered over a drum machine pulse that slowly builds toward one of the most explosive moments in pop music history changed everything. It was 1981, and a balding Englishman with sad eyes and a broken heart had just created something that would define a decade. Phil Collins was not supposed to be a frontman, not supposed to be a pop star, not supposed to be ubiquitous on every radio station across the globe. He was supposed to be the drummer, the guy behind the kit, the reliable heartbeat of a progressive rock band called Genesis. But behind the scenes, his marriage was falling apart, and he was channeling that devastation into music that would sell over 200 million records. He became the most inescapable artist of the 1980s, a man who seemed to be everywhere all the time on your radio and your television. And then came the backlash, the health problems, the loneliness, and a battle with alcohol that nearly killed him. So, what really happened to Phil Collins? Let's fade to black. Philip David Charles Collins was born on the 30th of January 1951 in Chiswick, a suburb in West London that sits along the River Thames. He was the youngest of 3 children born to Greville Collins, an insurance agent, and June Strange, who worked at a toy shop before becoming a theatrical agent. The Collins family lived modestly, moving twice before Phil was 3 years old, eventually settling on Hanworth Road in a comfortable but unremarkable house. His brother Clive would become a cartoonist, and his sister Carol competed professionally as an ice skater before becoming a theatrical agent like their mother. June was the one who nudged young Phil toward the spotlight, using her connections in the entertainment world to open doors for her son. She would take him to theaters and studios, exposing him to the world of performance before he was old enough to understand what a career even meant. When Phil was just 5 years old, his uncle made him a toy drum kit, and something clicked inside him that would never switch off. He would bang away on those makeshift drums for hours, completely lost in the rhythm, driving his family absolutely mad with the constant noise. His parents noticed something different about this obsession, something more intense than a typical childhood fascination, a focus that bordered on compulsion. By the time he was 12, his parents had bought him a real kit, and he practiced obsessively copying drummers from the action and studying the work of Buddy Rich. Phil took lessons from Lloyd Ryan and later Frank King, learning drum rudiments that he would later say were more helpful than anything else in his development. He never learned to read or write musical notation, instead developing his own system that he would later regret when working with formally trained musicians. But music was not his only path, not at first, because his mother enrolled him at the Barbara Speake Stage School for Performing Arts. He was a natural performer with an impish charm, and he landed his first major role as the Artful Dodger in the West End production of Oliver. His childhood friend Jack Wilde would later play the same role in the famous 1968 film after June spotted both boys playing football in the park. Phil even appeared as an extra in A Hard Day's Night, though you would need a keen eye to spot him screaming alongside hundreds of other Beatles fans. He was a kid actor with prospects, but the drums kept calling him louder than any stage director ever could. By his late teens, Phil had joined a band called Flaming Youth, who released one album that went nowhere before falling apart like most teenage dreams do. In the summer of 19-year-old Phil spotted an advertisement in Melody Maker magazine seeking a drummer sensitive to acoustic music. He recognized the name Tony Stratton Smith, a manager he knew from the London music scene, and made a call that would change his life forever. The band looking for a drummer was Genesis, a group of former public school boys who played intricate theatrical progressive rock music. Phil showed up at the audition at Peter Gabriel's parents' house in Surrey, arrived early, and took a swim in their pool while he waited. Through the window, he could hear the other drummers auditioning, and he memorized what they were playing before it was his turn at the kit. Tony Banks, the keyboardist, later said they knew Phil was the one the moment he sat down because of the confident way he approached the drums. He could swing, he could tell jokes that made them laugh, and he could sing backup vocals, which was a bonus they had not anticipated. On the 4th of August 1970, Phil wrote in his diary 2 words that would prove to be the understatement of his life: got job with Genesis. He was a working-class kid from Chiswick, suddenly surrounded by Charterhouse-educated musicians who spoke differently and came from money, but his talent bridged every gap. For the first 5 years with Genesis, Phil stayed behind the drums, while Peter Gabriel commanded the stage in elaborate costumes and theatrical performances. Gabriel was the face of the band, the visual spectacle, the storyteller who would wear fox heads and bat wings, while Phil kept time in the background. But Phil was always more than just a drummer, contributing to songs like Watcher of the Skies, and occasionally singing lead on quieter tracks like More Fool Me. Then in 1975, Peter Gabriel announced he was leaving Genesis, and suddenly the band faced an existential crisis that could have ended everything. They auditioned over 400 singers to replace their charismatic frontman, and Phil sat in on every single session, coaching the hopefuls through the songs. Weeks turned into months, and no one seemed right. No one could capture what Genesis needed until someone finally pointed out the obvious truth. The perfect replacement had been sitting behind the drums all along, coaching other singers, demonstrating how the melodies should sound, waiting without realizing what he was waiting for. Phil reluctantly stepped up to the microphone, recorded a track called Squonk, and the band members looked at each other and knew the search was over. He was terrified of performing without the security of his drum kit, of standing exposed at the front of a stage where Peter Gabriel once commanded attention. His first show as frontman was in March 1976 inches, London, Ontario, Canada, and he kept asking himself, what do I wear and what do I do? But he made it his own, refusing to wear the theatrical costumes, focusing on the music rather than spectacle, and somehow Genesis survived and then thrived. The late 70s saw Genesis transform from a cult progressive band into a commercial force, with Phil steering them toward more accessible radio-friendly sounds. Albums like A Trick of the Tail and Wind and Wuthering proved that the band could survive without Gabriel, and then came their breakthrough album Duke in 1980. But success was extracting a brutal toll on Phil's personal life, and his first marriage to childhood sweetheart Andrea Bertarelli was crumbling under the weight of touring. Andrea had given him an ultimatum before the 1978 World Tour: choose the band or choose your family, because you cannot have both. Phil chose the tour, believing Genesis was on the verge of their international breakthrough, and when he came home, Andrea had taken their children to Vancouver. He flew to Canada to save his marriage, but it was already over, and he returned to England, a broken man with an empty house and a shattered heart. Alone in his home studio with nothing but a drum machine and his grief, Phil began writing songs that would become his debut solo album, Face Value. The lyrics poured out of him like blood, from a wound raw and angry, and devastated the diary of a man watching his life collapse in slow motion. He played In the Air Tonight for his Genesis bandmates, but they thought it was too simple for the band, so he kept it for himself. That rejection turned out to be a blessing, because when Face Value dropped in February 1981, it became a worldwide phenomenon that eclipsed anything Genesis had achieved. In the Air Tonight was unlike anything else on the radio, a brooding atmospheric track that built with agonizing tension before exploding into that iconic drum fill. The gated reverb drum sound, developed accidentally with producer Hugh Padgham, became the sonic signature of the entire decade that followed. Phil had transformed his heartbreak into art, and the public responded by making him one of the biggest stars on the planet almost overnight. The 1980s belonged to Phil Collins in a way that seemed almost unfair to every other artist trying to compete for radio airplay and chart positions. In 1984, he wrote "Against All Odds" for the film of the same name, and it became his first #1 single on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. He won a Grammy for that song, and then collaborated with Philip Bailey of Earth, Wind and Fire on "Easy Lover," which climbed to #2. His second solo album, "Hello, I Must Be Going," arrived in 1982, followed by the juggernaut "No Jacket Required" in 1985, which won the Grammy for Album of the Year. That album sold over 25 million copies worldwide and was certified diamond in the United States for shipping 12 million units domestically alone. Singles like "Susudio," "One More Night," and "Against All Odds" dominated the charts, while his work with Genesis continued to sell millions with albums like "Invisible Touch." He produced albums for other artists too, lending his talents to Eric Clapton, Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin, and Frida from ABBA, among dozens of others. He had more American Top 40 singles during the 80s than any other artist, a statistic that still seems almost impossible when you consider the competition. The title "No Jacket Required" was a middle finger to a Chicago restaurant that had refused to seat him because his leather jacket was not proper attire. But it was Live Aid in July 1985 that cemented his status as the most ubiquitous rock star alive, a man who literally seemed to be everywhere at once. Phil performed at Wembley Stadium in London, then boarded a Concorde jet, flew across the Atlantic Ocean, and performed again at JFK Stadium in Philadelphia the same day. He played his solo hits, backed Eric Clapton on drums, and even joined the surviving members of Led Zeppelin for a reunion set that did not go well. Jimmy Page blamed Phil for the disastrous performance, but Collins was simply caught in the middle of Led Zeppelin's toxic internal dynamics and lack of rehearsal time. Still, the image of one man performing on 2 continents in a single day captured the imagination of a generation watching on television around the world. He was everywhere, inescapable, the balding everyman who had somehow become the biggest pop star in the world through sheer talent and relentless work ethic. But being everywhere meant that eventually people would get tired of seeing your face and hearing your voice on every radio station in existence. By the early 90s, the inevitable backlash had begun, with critics and listeners growing weary of what some called Phil Collins fatigue, or Philtigue for short. Radio stations ran Phil Collins free weekends as promotional stunts, and suddenly, the man who could do no wrong had become a punchline for being too successful. His 1,989 album, But Seriously, had sold millions and won Grammys for Another Day in Paradise, but the tide was turning against soft rock adult contemporary ballads. Some accused him of hypocrisy for writing about homelessness while being a millionaire, though he quietly donated enormous sums to charity without seeking publicity. His second marriage to Jill Tavelman, mother of his daughter Lily, fell apart in 1996, amid allegations of infidelity and rumors he ended things via fax machine. Phil has always denied the fax story, but the damage to his reputation was done, and he became an easy target for anyone wanting to mock 80s excess. He left Genesis in 1996 to focus on solo work and his family, but his subsequent albums, Dance into the Light and Testify, were commercial disappointments. Critics who had once praised him now declared his time was over, that audiences had moved on, that Phil Collins was yesterday's news in a world chasing tomorrow. He retreated to Switzerland with his third wife, Oriane Cevey, whom he married in 1999, trying to find peace away from the spotlight that had once warmed him. But 1,999 also brought an unexpected triumph when Disney hired him to write the songs for their animated film Tarzan, a project that would reignite his career. He wrote and performed every song on that soundtrack, including Two Worlds Strangers Like Me, Son of Man, and the tender ballad, You'll Be in My Heart. That song, which he had originally written as a lullaby for his daughter Lily, won the Academy Award for Best Original Song at the 2000 ceremony. Standing on that stage at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles, holding an Oscar, Phil said, "You do not know what this means to me," with tears in his eyes. It was vindication after years of critical dismissal, proof that he could still create music that moved people, even when the tastemakers had written him off as irrelevant. The Tarzan soundtrack won a Grammy for Best Soundtrack Album and became his best-selling album of new material in over a decade, reaching double platinum status. But peace proved elusive, and his marriage to Oriane ended in 2008 with a settlement of £25 million, the largest divorce payout in British celebrity history at that time. And then came the really dark years, the ones that almost killed him, when Phil Collins had everything except a reason to get out of bed in the morning. He retired from music in 2011, citing health problems, including a dislocated vertebra from years of drumming that had left him with nerve damage in his hands. His spine was crushing his spinal cord from decades of hunching over a drum kit, and suddenly, he could not hold drumsticks without excruciating pain shooting through his fingers. Alone in Switzerland, his third marriage over his children living across the ocean in Miami, Phil found himself with nothing to do and nowhere to be. He started drinking first wine in the evenings, then vodka earlier and earlier in the day, until alcohol had become his only companion in that big empty house. "I put the brakes on, which is like an oil tanker," he later said. "It takes a long time to stop, and then suddenly you are killing yourself." A bout of pancreatitis nearly ended his life, landing him in intensive care with tubes coming out of his neck and machines beeping constantly around him. A doctor asked his family if his will was in order, and Phil lay there in that hospital bed, thinking about everything he had lost and wasted. He had gotten through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s without becoming an alcoholic, only to fall apart in retirement at age 55. Depression, loneliness, 3 failed marriages, and a body that could no longer do the one thing he had loved since he was 5 years old with that toy drum kit. The man who had sold 200 million records was lying in a Swiss hospital, broken and alone, wondering if this was how his story would end. But Phil Collins was not dead yet, and that phrase would become the title of both his memoir and the comeback tour nobody saw coming. In 2016, he published Not Dead, yet an autobiography that was brutally honest about his failures, his addictions, his mistakes in marriage, and his struggle to find meaning. The book was a confession and a reckoning, written by a man who had finally made peace with who he was and who he had failed to be. He wrote about the disappointment of 3 divorces, admitting that while it might seem to suggest a casual attitude toward marriage, nothing could be further from the truth. "I am a romantic who believes that the union of marriage is something to cherish," he wrote. "Yet my divorces demonstrate a failure to coexist happily with my partners." He announced he was coming out of retirement not to play drums, because his body would not allow that anymore, but to sing the songs that had defined his career. The music world was skeptical at first, wondering if this was a cash grab or a vanity project from a man who should have stayed retired gracefully. The Not Dead Yet tour launched in 2017, with Phil performing from a seated position while his teenage son Nicholas played drums behind him with stunning precision. Nicholas had grown up watching his father play, had been drumming since he was 2 years old, and now at just 15, he was keeping his father's legacy alive. Tony Banks of Genesis praised Nicholas, saying he was not only a great drummer, but capable of sounding like early Phil, which was exciting for the band. Watching Phil on that tour was bittersweet, a once dynamic performer now limited by a body that had given everything it had to 5 decades of music. He needed a cane to walk, suffered from drop foot that made every step uncertain, but his voice still carried those familiar melodies that had soundtracked millions of lives. During the tour, old friend Mike Rutherford began showing up at concerts, and the two would perform Follow You, Follow Me together, hinting at something bigger. Then, in 2020, the unthinkable happened. Genesis announced a reunion tour with the classic trio of Phil "Tony" Banks and Mike Rutherford playing together one last time. The last Domino tour, delayed by the pandemic, finally launched in 2021, with Phil again performing seated, while Nicholas channeled his father's drumming brilliance from behind the kit. On the 26th of March 2022, at the O2 Arena in London, Phil Collins walked on stage for what everyone knew would likely be his final performance with the band he had joined 52 years earlier. "This is the last show for Genesis," he told the crowd, and then they played through a set list spanning decades of music that had shaped rock and roll history. Phil has since said he is done, that he has used up his air miles, that if he cannot do what he did as well as he did it, he would rather not do it at all. And so we arrive at the present day, where Phil Collins lives quietly in Miami, under 24-hour care, his body battered, but his legacy secure beyond any reasonable doubt. He recently celebrated 2 years of sobriety after admitting his kidneys were damaged from drinking too much during those dark years of retirement and isolation. In a recent documentary called Phil Collins Drummer First, he reflected on a career that spanned more than 50 years of constant creation and performance. "Drumming has taken its toll on my hands and legs," he said, "and if I cannot do what I did as well as I did it, I would rather not do anything." His daughter Lily has become a successful actress, starring in shows like Emily in Paris, and films like Mirror Mirror, and Tolkien, and many others. She has written publicly about forgiving her father for the absences and the mistakes and the pain of his divorces, choosing reconciliation over resentment. His son, Nicholas, continues to tour and record, carrying forward a drumming tradition that stretches back to that toy kit Phil received when he was 5 years old. Nicholas plays in his own bands now, Better Strangers and The Effect, proving that musical talent can indeed be passed from one generation to the next. The music endures, of course, rediscovered by each new generation, with In the Air Tonight going viral, decades after its release, whenever someone new hears that drum fill. Phil Collins is one of only 3 artists in history, alongside Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson, to have sold over 100 million records, both solo and with a band. He won 8 Grammy Awards, 6 Brit Awards, 2 Golden Globes, an Academy Award, and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with Genesis in 2010. He has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame and was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame, recognition that once seemed impossible for a drummer from Chiswick. Phil Collins was never supposed to be a frontman, never supposed to be a pop star, never supposed to dominate an entire decade of popular music. He was supposed to be the drummer, the guy in the background, the reliable heartbeat who kept time while someone else took the spotlight and the glory. But life has a way of pushing ordinary people into extraordinary circumstances, and Phil Collins rose to meet every challenge until his body simply could not carry him anymore. He turned heartbreak into art that resonated with millions, turned personal tragedy into universal anthems that played at weddings and funerals and everywhere in between. And that is the thing about Phil Collins: he was always more fragile than he appeared, more human than his critics wanted to admit, more complicated than any headline could capture. He made mistakes, failed at marriage 3 times, struggled with demons that nearly destroyed him, and somehow kept getting back up until he physically could not anymore. His story is not one of uninterrupted triumph, but of resilience, of a working-class kid from West London who became one of the best-selling artists in history. So what really happened to Phil Collins? He lived fully and messily and imperfectly, the way most of us do when nobody is watching, but with the whole world paying attention. He loved and lost, and loved again, chased success, until it overwhelmed him, retreated from the spotlight, and then returned because the music would not let him go. He sat in a chair on stages around the world because standing was no longer possible, and he sang his heart out anyway because that was all he had left to give. Phil Collins taught us that even the biggest pop stars are just people underneath the fame, fragile humans trying to figure out how to survive their own lives. And in the end, he figured it out. Not perfectly, but well enough to say goodbye on his own terms, surrounded by the music that had been his companion since childhood. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this look at Phil Collins's life, please leave a comment, like this video, and subscribe to the channel. And as ever, I really do look forward to seeing you all in the next one.